Norelco Cassette 2B, Kuhlman on the Seychelles.
But as I began to read on, and then I thought, well, I'm going to have the shortest travel talk on record. I'm going to tell them it's going to be hot, take a raincoat, that they're almost on the equator, and there isn't very much to buy when you get there. But then I began to dig in a little further, and I found some very interesting things that I think maybe will interest you in your travels around these very remote places tomorrow. The Garden of Eden was supposed to be there. And I suddenly thought, why was it called the Garden of Eden? There must be some reason for it. The islands capitulated to the British 7 times. Well, now, why did they have to surrender 7 times? There must be an interesting reason for that. Then I discovered the largest fruit trees in the world are there. The oldest mammals in the world are there. Not animals actually, are there. And probably the world's most stupid birds. Well, that gave me something to go on. And then when I started to analyze it, I realized the people are mostly African and Asian. The language is a sort of French. The money is a rupee, which is Indian, and they belong to the British as a crown colony, which leaves you with quite a paradox to unravel. Well, then we look a little further. The islands are very small. Even though there are 92 of them, they put them all together. They're only about 150 square miles all total, which isn't very much at all as far as the lands of the world are concerned. We're going to the largest one called Mahe, M-A-H-E. And that's only about 55 square miles. It's about 17 miles long and averages between 3 and 4 miles wide. And this is a granite island, which is very unusual for tropical islands. Most tropical islands are coral or they're volcanic and lava. But this one happens to be granite through a geological technicality, which is not particularly interesting, so we won't go into it right now. But they are granite. This explains why these islands are quite remote, because it's been almost impossible to build an airport on these islands. It's a matter of blasting right out of sheer granite. However, I understand that an island, there should be an airport by about 1970, so I think we're lucky to go here now, because this is still the island of one-upmanship, and after you've been here, believe me, you can play it when you get back home. You know, you'll start to say, now remember, I want to tell you when I was in Kruger Park and saw the lion, and somebody else say, well, when I was in Kruger Park, I saw 3 lions. Or they'll say, well, when I was in India, when we were in India, we did, you know how it goes, that even the cocktail parties on the ship, but when you get back to your ladies' club or your Rotary Club and say, well, now, when I was in the Seychelles, you've got to stop cold, because nobody else will have been there. Well, a few early people were there. The Arabs probably came first from Saudi Arabia back and forth with their little dhows. They weren't very good sailors, but they managed to stop on the island. This was a strange sea to them. They didn't venture very far into it, and this is the area where Sinbad, the sailor, is supposed to have traveled on his adventures, and this is the Sea of Zanj that is written about in Sinbad's adventures, and somewhere on these islands there was supposed to be the magnetic mountain that Sinbad discovered, and also birds that were big enough to feed elephant to their young. Now, I think that's highly exaggerated, but if you read Sinbad's stories, this is what Sinbad the sailor found. Well, as far as the Western world is concerned, our old friends, the Portuguese, probably got here first. They landed in Mahe, and when we're around Mahe, when we go into Victoria, which is a city tomorrow, named for Queen Victoria, you will see there are islands, and it should be a very beautiful entry, so we all should be up bright and early on the deck there. They called these islands the Seven Sisters. The islands were deserted. As we spoke the other day, the Portuguese weren't interested in colonization. All they wanted was to get the spice from the Orient back into Portugal and all the money that went along with it. So the Portuguese went by the islands and didn't use them at all. Then for about several hundred years, about the 18th century or so, right around there, 1700s, early 1800s, they were hideouts for pirates. Pirates of all kinds and slave ships that were going back and forth. Pirates of the French, the pirates of the British, pirates of the Arabs, pirates of the Dutch, slave ships who were trying to escape the British warships after Britain outlawed slavery. They were using these islands as hiding places. And finally, the French decided to take over the islands. They had belonged to, well, the islands had belonged to no one at that point, but the French had the island of Mauritius, which is down off the coast of Madagascar, a little further south. We don't go there, but the French were already settled on this island. They were afraid that the British were going to take over the island. It was the old story that we had in Africa. The French really didn't want the islands, but they didn't want the British to have it, so we'll take it over. And they named the main island for Mahé de la Bourdonnais, who was the governor of Mauritius at the time. So they cut his long name down just to Mahé, which is his first name, and gave that name to the island. Then as they gradually settled more and more in this area, they named a group of islands for the Controller General of Louis XV of France, who was King of France at that time, and his name was Count de Seychelles. So it doesn't come from the word seashell at all. It comes from the French Controller General of Louis XV, who was named the Count de Seychelles. Then later the British changed the islands just to the British spelling and pronunciation of the Seychelles Islands. Well, for a small colony, it began to make quite rapid progress, and the French colonists that came to settle discovered coconuts were there, so they started to grow them in more logical fashion. They planted maize, sort of our equivalent of corn, and were quite self-sufficient. They planted cotton, they planted coffee, and they discovered that the spices grew very well here. So they had their spice plantations. They tried to keep them secret because they were trying to break the monopoly that the Dutch had on the spice at that time. You remember we were talking about the Dutch coming into Cape Town, where we had been, and the Dutch, of course, were going back and forth. And pretty much by that time, the Dutch East India Company had achieved a monopoly on the spices, so the French were out to break it and get more money themselves. So there were about 2,000 colonists with their slaves. Slaves were imported to do the work, of course, because there weren't enough colonists to be able to support the agriculture that had to be done for these people to live. And some Indians from India, about 1,400 miles away, began to come in. They were living a very quiet, placid life there, and all of a sudden in 1780, some ships appeared on the horizon. They were flying an English flag, but no one knew what ships they were, because in these days of piracy, you flew almost any flag that was convenient. If you were a French ship and you thought you were going to run into some English ships, you'd run up an English flag and hope that the English wouldn't bother you. So the ship came in with an English flag on it. The planters got very upset, thought that the English were coming in and were going to find their plantations, so they set fire to all of the spice plantations and burned them all off. About the only spice that survived these great fires was cinnamon. And this is the spice that is still exported from this island today. The cinnamon is the bark of sort of an evergreen tree, and the bark is peeled off very carefully. The outside is scraped, and then as it dries, well, you get your long cinnamon sticks that are curled up. It's not an important export from this island because the cinnamon from Ceylon is considered much finer and better, and Ceylon sort of does much more with cinnamon than this island does. But this is the spice that remains. After they had burned all the islands, they discovered to their dismay that they weren't English ships at all, that they really were French ships, and had been flying the English flag just in case of that they might run into some English warships. But England and France were already beginning to have many squabbles in Europe at that time. The island then went along. They tried to restore some of their economy, and finally a governor was appointed to the island whose name was Chevalier Kuhlman, Q-U-I-N-C-Y, but in French, of course, it was Cancé. Well, he was a most astute governor and a very good diplomat. You know, there's a saying that one thing that diplomats, women, and crabs all have in common. When you think they're going, they're coming, and when you think they're coming, they're going, and vice versa all the way around. Well, Cancé was a really true diplomat because nobody knew whether he was coming or going, for a story that I think is very interesting and rather amusing. At this time, England and France were fighting each other, and they never knew who was going to show up at the island next. Now, Cassay was French through and through, so were the people on the island. But a British ship arrived one day, anchored out in the harbor, and said, we want some water, we want some supplies, and we want to dump here on the island 200 French prisoners that we've taken from our battles with the French ships in this area. Well, Cassay said, we can't do that. We don't have enough food for the prisoners, and we don't have enough food to give it to you or to give you water. The British said, well, what are you going to do about it? You better surrender or else. Now, poor Mr. the Governor had one little cannon that couldn't possibly even hit the British ships that were out in the harbor, so he decided the best thing to do was sign an agreement of surrender and sign the islands over to the British, which he did. So there was a great ceremony. All the islanders came. The French flag was run down. The British flag was put up on the flagpole. The Cassay was given a British uniform, because none of the British wanted to stay. They all just wanted to take the island and get out of there, so they decided to leave him on as governor. He was given a British uniform, and his name was changed to Quincy. This was on, well, the British stayed about 2 weeks, took their supplies with them, and all the British left, leaving Quincy in charge. This was on June the 1st. June the 2nd, Quincy called all the colonists together. They ran down the British flag, ran up the French flag. He put on his British uniform and changed his name to Cassay, and they were all very happily French again. So the French thought the islands were French. The British thought the islands were British. Within the course of about 15 years, Cassay changed his name back and forth from Cassay when the French arrived to Quincy when the British arrived, ran up and down the flag. They also had a flag made up that said, Seychelles capitulate. So when the British would come in, they'd run up the British flag, run up the flag that said, we capitulate, and everybody was British. When the French would come in, they'd run up, you had to just see him, with his sentries right out there watching every ship and saying, oh my goodness, there's a British ship and I've got a French uniform on, we've got to do something about this in a hurry. So he needs to go change his uniform and come back out. Well, these are some of the, you can turn history into very amusing things if you just use your imagination a little bit. Well, finally, the Napoleonic Wars came along. As you know, the British took over South Africa. The British took over almost everybody's possessions in the area. And despite the fact that Mr. Quincy, as one of his biographers said, he was 50% British and 100% French, he was always hoping the island would remain French. They didn't. They belonged to Britain. But again, it was a matter of Britain really didn't want to do very much with it, so no British colonists came down to settle at all. They sent down 1 or 2 men to govern the islands after Mr. Quincy died, but the British left him on. They liked this idea. He had been such an astute diplomat that when they took over the island for all time, it was a very nice gesture. They left him on as governor until his death at about 80 years of age. And his tomb is up near the governor's house right now. And if you're very interested, you can go up and find the tomb of this very remarkable man. But the British colonists, as I said, didn't come down. The island just sort of went along its own lazy way. Most of the visitors were all transients. They were mostly male because they were sailors or they were pirates. The female populace of the island, of course, liked this very much, and all the men coming through were sort of given the sailors' welcome. And the sons of the French planters found life there pretty monotonous, so well, all I can say is gradually the white people became darker and the black people became whiter, and the island just sort of went along in its own stupor, and it still is sort of to this day. The one thing the British did with it after they took it over, they used it as a place of exile, because as I say, we're almost out in the middle of 1,000 miles away from anywhere, and they exiled some political prisoners on this island. We'll talk about only 2 of them, who I found the most interesting of them all. But before even the British took over, one exile, a very intriguing man.
Norelco Cassette 1A. Continuation of Kuhlman on the Seychelles.
French names that the French were wont to do, but each one had the name Dauphin in the name. If you remember your French Revolution, Louis XVI killed. Marie Antoinette, his wife, was beheaded. Their children were killed, except for the young Dauphin. No one has ever to this day known what happened to him. This man appeared was about the age of the Dauphin, about the time when he disappeared. The names were given to all the children, and their descendants all had the famous Bourbon nose and the underslung chin of the Bourbon family. It's a very interesting sci-fi. There are many people who still claim that the Dauphin of France, after his mother, Marie Antoinette, was guillotined, came here and settled. But again, no one really knows. However, we do know about a few of the other people who were exiled here. Now, when the British were trying to settle the hash of the colored races in Africa, they had many tribal kings that they didn't want to kill, but they couldn't leave them there because they were stirring up trouble, so they would exile the tribal kings over here to the Seychelles. And the most interesting one, since we talked about the man who could change his, affiliations back and forth, was King Prem of Ashanti. Now, Ashanti was an area that is British West Africa now. He was sent over here by the Britons, and he arrived with his mother, 3 wives, a retinue and slaves of about 35, and his official executioner. And he arrived wearing nothing but a leopard skin. He stayed 20 years. When he left in a silk hat, a cutaway coat, striped trousers, was a devout member of the Church of England, had disposed of 2 of his wives, had only 1. And the only problem he had was he still couldn't understand why he couldn't use the chief executioner to chop off anybody's head when it displeased him. So he went back. The British sent many of the other colonial leaders who caused trouble over here, and just as one little side, the last famous exile ever to be on this island we all know about, we've all read about, he's still very much living today, and that was the Archbishop Makarios, who's now the president of Cyprus. He was exiled to this island for a short time some years ago. Well, the last person we're going to talk about, I think, is the most interesting of all, and he gave the name of the Garden of Eden to this island. Now, before we talk about him, you've got to backtrack a little bit. One of the things you will see on this island are the largest fruit trees in the world. They're about 100 feet tall, and they produce the famous double coconuts. They are huge coconuts, double in size, and may weigh from 40 to 50, sometimes even 60 pounds when they're fully mature. They're very erotic in shape, and we'll have to delve into a few little eroticisms this morning, but you must go along with me to understand the problem and why it was called the Garden of Eden. They are erotic in shape because they sort of look like the lower female anatomy without the legs. You know, now from now on you use your imagination. Anyway, these tremendous double coconuts used to fall off the trees and would float with the current over to India, and they would be found washed up on the shores of India. Because of their erotic shape, they thought that there was something mysterious about them, because now you must remember too, and as we get into India and all the eastern countries, a great part of their religion is based on the importance of reproduction, the importance of fertility, the importance of living, the importance of having more food. In fact, many symbols and even buildings you're going to see when you get into India, when you get to Bangkok, when you even get to Japan, are all really symbols of the god of fertility. You may not know it, but that's what it is, and the guys usually talk around this. But nevertheless, these huge double coconuts were very intriguing, and they became extremely valuable. Tremendous prices were paid for them by the Indian potentates that could afford to buy these nuts, and nobody knew really where they came from. They just suddenly appeared on the shore, so it was thought that these strange, huge double fruit had some almost divine origin. Well, later it was discovered by some of the French explorers when they got to these islands that they actually were the products of this tremendous 100-foot tall tree. So some enterprising Frenchmen gathered up hundreds of them, took them to India. Immediately the bottom fell out of the market because they were no longer mysterious, and now they only have only sort of a slight curiosity interest, that there's not any great value and there's no great food value to them. But General Gordon, you remember remember General Gordon of cartoon fame. In fact, several years ago, he was masquerading as Charlton Heston in the movie Cartoon, one of the great explorers of Africa. He was the man who was killed where the White Nile and the Blue Nile meet. Well, about 4 years before this, he was sent out, General Gordon was sent out on an exploration into these areas, to the Seychelles Islands. They belonged to the British by then. But he was to see whether these islands should be fortified as just general British fortification in this area. His report was that they were not to be fortified, they weren't worth it, but he landed on an island very near Mahé, where we're going to be landing tomorrow, went into a valley and discovered to his amazement these tremendous trees. And he also discovered that there is a male tree and a female tree. Now, we've already described the fruit of a female tree. The male tree has a tremendous sort of catkin that gives off pollen, and it reminded him very much of a human male. He looked at these trees. No one had ever seen them before in Europe, particularly. Some of the colonists had, but no one had ever described it. And Gordon was a very religious man, and he wrote a long and technical treatise on these trees, sincerely believing that these were the trees of knowledge of good and evil, that they were the trees that were given human qualities, the male tree and the female tree. He was struck by this tremendous resemblance. In fact, he wrote in one of his treatises, as we believe that there was a tree of knowledge of good and evil and a tree of life, actual trees set aside for a time to be imbued with mystical powers, there is no reason why these trees should not now exist, relegated, of course, back to ordinary trees. So he became convinced that this was indeed the Garden of Eden, that these were the trees of knowledge, the trees of good and evil, that there were no snakes on the island, so the snake had been driven out along with Adam and Eve, and he believed also sincerely that this was originally a continent that had been flooded by the great flood of the Bible, and that what remained were just the tops of the mountains of the original continent that had been there during biblical times. So this is why this land is known throughout the world as the Garden of Eden. And you know, perhaps it really is. If you look at the life of some of the native people there, the main export of this island is copra. Now, copra is, C-O-P-R-A, is the dried meat of the coconut, which is dried on the island and then is shipped all over the world because the oil from it is used for soap, used for cosmetics, it's used for margarine, for many, many, many different uses for the oil of the copra. Now, to gather the copra, there are these tremendous coconut plantations, but a lot of the natives, sort of early in the morning before it gets too hot, will get up and gather their quota of coconuts. By 9 o'clock in the day, they're finished. Coconuts are turned into the plantation owner. They get their little money that will keep them through the day, and the rest of the day they just sort of laze around and do nothing. And if you want to laze around and do nothing, I meant to tell you, don't worry about lying under a coconut tree tomorrow and relaxing. You won't get hit on the head because 90% of them fall at night. So you're pretty well safe, and so are the natives after 9 o'clock in the morning. It's when the temperature changes at night that something snaps in the little stem and the coconuts fall down. So it is an island of tranquility, of relaxation. I think the one little item that might give you a clue to the island most of all is that in the cathedral church there is a clock. And for many, many years, and I hope it still does, it did as of 2 years ago, I understand, the clock strikes twice. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it will strike 4 o'clock. But just in case you're sort of half asleep or you're too busy doing nothing to count, you're a little alerted, and then 3 minutes later, it strikes 4 o'clock again. So you're on the alert and you can count up to 4. To me, the idea of an island where the clock has to strike twice so everybody can become alert enough to count the hours is sort of my idea of an ideal place to spend a day, being absolutely, see what there is, quiet and tranquil, and resting out in the noonday sun. So tomorrow when we're going to go in, it'll be a rather beautiful entry through the little island into the place where we drop anchor. There is a very long, long pier. It's about a half a mile long, as you've read in your daily papers. The tenders will take us to the end of the pier, and there the ship has arranged transportation for you down to the end of the pier and into the heart of this little town. The town of Victoria has about 11,000 people. There are about 43,000 people in the Seychelles Islands altogether, and about 11,000 live in and around this Victoria. When you're going in on the tender, try to look down in the water if you can, because there are magnificent, beautiful, multicolored tropical fish in the area. The water should be very clear unless there happens to be a rainfall or a heavy wind, and you will see the beautiful coral reefs and tropical fish. The lorries, as they are politely called in the paper, are mostly converted trucks that will take you down into town, because they don't have buses. The transportation on the island is virtually nil. There is a little bit, but don't expect a fleet of taxi cabs to be down to welcome you, because they just don't exist on the island. When you come in, you will see the magnificent beaches on all the islands. The houses some of them are of granite of the island. Some of them look quite English and colonial. Some of them are very ramshackle wooden affairs of the native people with their corrugated wooden roofs and the winding streets, sort of like French Martinique in a way. The town has one important monument, well, a monument so to speak, as far as the people are concerned, and that is in the center of town. You will see another clock tower. It's a smallish affair, but it's a copy of Big Ben. And it was erected in the memory of Queen Victoria. I think in the year 1901 or 1902, several years after her death, it was erected, and it's called the Victoria Clock Memorial. It's sort of a copy of Big Ben. For many years, it was the pride and joy of the people, and if someone was a remote man from one of the other islanders or from way off somewhere else on the island of Mahé, you didn't call him a country bumpkin. There was a French phrase for it, which translated means he hadn't seen the clock. So he's just sort of a country boy who's never really been anywhere at all. The climate, as I said, will be very hot. The language is a French, sort of an 17th, 18th century French patois with some local words mixed in, a few English words mixed in, a few Indian words mixed in. There isn't too much shopping. You will find some, I think you can buy the double coconuts, which are highly polished and cut open, and you can use them for fruit bowls. If you feel you can't get along without a double coconut fruit bowl, well, you can bring one of those on. There are straw hats that are woven by the natives. You'll find a few British goods, some Indian goods, because most of the merchants here are Indian people, or the clerks are Indians that have come over a period of years from India. The money is the rupee. It's called a Seychelles rupee, but it has the same value as an Indian rupee, which now is about 13 or 14 cents since the devaluation of the British pound. I haven't been there. I understand the main hotel is called the Pirate's Arms, and so maybe you will find a pirate or so who are very happy to welcome you there. As I mentioned, don't drink the water particularly. I'm sure Scotch soda, the British drinks, will be available to you. As you walk around the town, I think you'll be interested in stopping at the botanical gardens. They aren't very large, but they're very, very famous. You will see there the huge fruit trees that grow 100 feet straight up in the air, the male trees, the female trees that produce the famous coco de mer, as these double coconuts are called, or the coconut of the sea. You'll also there see probably, no one really knows how old they grow, but the oldest animals in the world, and these are those giant land tortoises. Some of you maybe have seen pictures of them. The favorite sport for children to sort of sit on their backs and supposed to ride them. They grow to tremendous sizes, 500 to 600 pounds. It's thought that they live to 500 years of age, but no one has ever proven this. There are some that are known to be over 200 years old, but 500 seems stretching it a little bit. And the children, in fact, maybe you can sit down on one, but you don't get much of a ride, because the minute you do, they pull in their legs and heave tremendous sighs and sort of cry very gummy tears and sit there until you kind of get off, and then they may move around a little bit. But they are the tremendous, famous land tortoises that are found only here and in one of the other islands where they're actually imported from. They're not native from here, and they are found on a few islands down in the South Pacific. Over the way, the great palm trees also are only found native in this area. They can grow natively here, but a few have been exported to Trinidad. And is anyone here from Coconut Grove, Florida? If you are, you've got a few of them growing there, whether you know it or not. You'll see the beautiful beaches. You'll be in this very tranquil land, the island where the clocks chime twice. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you all tomorrow in the Garden of Eden. Have a good time there.